I would like to introduce you to this event. My name is Professor Ileana Kuzhenko. I am often the senior thesis director, but I'm not this year. But this year we're just, I'm joining you as part of the Griswold Center, along with the Junior Independent Work Program. And the purpose of this event is to give the juniors some ideas of what it's like to write a junior paper. So we, at the end of last year, collected nominations among professors for excellent junior papers. The provision being they had to be policy related because that's what our center works on. And we collect these papers. We work with the authors to come up with presentations. This is the fourth year we're doing it. And then we put it on for all of the incoming juniors to give you a sense of what makes a successful junior paper. We want you to think of this as like a starting point and not something like, oh, I have to do something like that. Just think of this event as piquing your curiosity, giving you some sense of like what the final product looks like, but certainly don't feel like you need to limit yourself to the topics that you see presented today. And you'll see there's a wide variety of topics that will be covered today. Before getting onto the main program, I would like to thank a few people. The junior paper team, Kelly Noonan, Professors Kelly Noonan, Sylvia Weyerbrook, and Smita Brunemeyer, who will be guiding, who are sort of in charge of the junior paper experience, and they're experts. So will be great helps to you. And then I would like to thank Dana and Kathleen, who work with me at the Griswold Center for organizing the event. So did I forget to say anything, Dana? Okay. I will now leave it up to the stars of the show, which are our seniors presenting their junior papers.
Our first presentation is actually by Asher Joy, and Asher is abroad, and given the time difference, we decided that a virtual presentation would be better. So give me just 1 second, and we will hear from Asher.
Hi guys, my name is Asher, and my junior paper was on Is the Common Core at the Core of Educational Equity, where I explored the effect of the Common Core state standards on race and income-based achievement gaps. So why does this matter? So the Common Core was a national standard that was introduced in 2010 that wanted to unify state standards into one standard. So before, all states had their own standard, different levels of rigor, and the national standard would be one rigorous level that was supposed to essentially provide a common playing ground for all states and all students in all states. So what I wanted to explore is, how can this unification essentially affect educational inequity? So the achievement gap between Black and white students and economically advantaged versus disadvantaged students has persisted over time and has particularly been higher for mathematics-based gaps. So one factor that's correlated with educational resources and therefore these achievement gaps is district poverty level. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to look at how the implementation of the Common Core state standards affected the achievement gap between Black and white students and economically advantaged versus disadvantaged students in districts of varying poverty levels. A note on notation in case you missed it on the last slide is that economically advantaged students are NEC students and disadvantaged students are ECD students. So in terms of creating poverty level within a district was defined by two thresholds: less than 33% eligible for free and reduced price lunch, or more than 66% eligible as being a high poverty district. Therefore, we can create essentially a dichotomy of poverty. So as you can see on the chart here, only 5 students didn't implement the Common Core. Most of them actually implemented in 2014, but because many implemented at different times, I had to use an event study, which I will discuss in a few moments. So first, the data that I used was the Stanford Education Data Archive. I'm looking at grades 3rd through 8th from 2009 to 2018. And essentially, the outcome variable looks at the average mathematics scores for the level effects, Black students, white students, ECD students, NEC students, and also the gap scores for Black and white and ECD economically disadvantaged and NEC economically advantaged students. My treatment variable is a binary variable that is 1 or 0 if the Common Core was implemented or not. And for controls, I tried to control for factors that would affect achievement, like, for example, SES status or unemployment rate within a district. So as I said before, my methodology is an event study that essentially captures a time of implementation and 3 years before implementation and 3 years after implementation to determine, after implementation, was there an effect of the Common Core on both the level effects, so the individual average score effects, and the gap effects, so the gap between, for example, Black and white students. So first, with the methodology, I'm using the event study, you have to check for parallel trends. So essentially, you want districts that did implement versus districts that did not implement to have roughly the same trend in score. So there's no, unusual trend before. So the first implementation of the Common Core was in 2012. But as you can see here, for high poverty districts, both prior to implementation, we see that between, for example, average scores of Black students that didn't implement and average scores of Black students in districts that did implement, the trends are roughly parallel. So therefore, I can go through with my analysis. So the results that I found are that there's a statistically significant decline in the ECD-NEC gap, regardless of poverty level, so taking aside poverty level, that's seemingly driven by, as you can see here, a statistically significant decline in the performance of NEC, or economically advantaged students. Now, looking at by district poverty level, we can see that once again, there's a statistically significant decline for any students in low poverty districts. So the low poverty districts have this decline in their gap, and that's driven by the level effect, a decline in the performance of economically advantaged students in low poverty districts. On the other hand, in high poverty districts, we don't really see a change in the performance of the gap or the level effect. Now, moving on to the Black-white gap, we can see that there is a statistically significant decline in the scores of white students in low poverty districts. But why is the gap not statistically significant, as we can see here? Could be because there's just too much noise in the data. It's district averages, so they can't perfectly capture individual level effects, and there's not enough data points to see that. But as white students tend to concentrate more in low poverty districts and Black students in high poverty districts, it's very well likely to be the fact that, as you can see here, there's a visual decline in the Black-white gap. So the same trend should hold, that there's a decline in the Black-white gap that's driven by a decline in the scores of white students in low poverty districts. So essentially the most resource-rich districts are suffering the most. So, consistent with previous research, my research shows that the national standards were ineffective. They didn't improve educational equity for anyone. Low-performing students continue to perform lower, and high-performing students perform the worst in these resource-rich, low-poverty districts. Some potential reasons could be difficulties in implementing the Common Core. It was a standard, not a curriculum. So the curriculum varies depending on the district. And generally, teachers tend to do this teaching to the top method, in which they teach, their content is catered toward the best performing students, leaving the worst performing students behind. And so when you have a new standard that's a sudden shock to the curriculum, they aren't able to adjust as quickly. And so these high performing students might see a decline in their performance. So of course, my study is not without limitations. The data set I use doesn't show change at the individual level. It's only the average district score, for example, of Black students, of white students. So it can't control for individual demographic covariates that influence academic achievement, such as parental income or parental educational background. Additionally, you can't control for teacher attitudes. Some teachers might have hated the Common Core, some might have enjoyed it. That can influence how they teach different groups of students. And lastly, the data set doesn't have data for all districts. Districts with less than 20 people within a particular subgroup, for example, 20 people who are economically disadvantaged, are repressed. Their scores are not shown. So further research could use a larger data set that includes more districts that contain individual level data. And you can also look at alternative scores like ACT or SAT scores for higher grades above 8th grade to see if these people who have been in school for the longest period of time and experienced this sudden shock, how did it affect, for example, their college readiness and their ability to score in mathematics in these different grades? So in conclusion, the Common Core had the greatest negative impact on economically advantaged students and white students in wealthier districts and didn't have any effect on economically disadvantaged and Black students in high poverty districts. So what this means is that this one size fits all of the Common Core in creating a national standard and is not an effective solution to provide educational equity within the classroom. So thank you for listening.
All right. So our next presenter is JC Martinez, and give me a second to just get your slides up here. I do. So the pointer's the red guy. Right there, this one. And then this is going to get you to your slides.
How do I point them? Hello, everyone. What's up? My name is JC. I'll be presenting on my JP today, which is about the political implications of corporate philanthropy. First, though, I want to thank my advisor, Professor Natalie Cox, and my AI, Jessica Min, for helping me complete this project from its inception. And I also thank Professor Nolan McCarty, Rafael Parente, Angela DeSantis, Sebastian Rolsgaard, and Professor Miha Kalasar, and Professor Mark Watson for a lot of discussions which made my ideas stronger and more sophisticated. And then lastly, I also thank Bob Ray for help with data collection, and Oscar for spending hours in the trenches with me working on that data. Okay, so onto the paper. It's generally thought that there's this idea that corporate money in politics is not a good thing for democracy, and that kind of makes sense. And it's usually generally thought that there's too much corporate money in politics. But if you consider just how much money is at stake in the public policies, there's like hundreds of billions of dollars of public expenditure that's at stake. And then you look at how much corporate money is in politics, it's like almost too little. So there's this question of what. Hard to point at this angle, but why is there so little corporate money in politics? So one possible answer is maybe there is other corporate money in politics that we just don't know about, because the two traditional channels that a lot of people study are PAC contributions, and that's basically when a corporation donates to the campaign of a politician, and lobbying. So one other under the table obscure potential avenue is corporate philanthropy. Because a lot of big corporations have a charitable arm, and then they'll donate to a lot of charities around the U.S. using that charitable arm. So like the Coca-Cola Foundation, for instance. So this Bertrand paper finds that large corporations donate more to charities who are connected to politicians who work on committee assignments, such that those politicians are more politically important to issues that are important to the firm's profitability. And that was a really hard to understand explanation. So basically, if I'm a banana company, so I make bananas or grow them or whatever, and there's a politician that works in the banana committee, I'm more likely to donate to a charity that's linked to that politician than I am to donate to a charity linked to a politician who works in the Apple committee, right? So that's sort of the idea. And when I say that a politician is linked to a charity, I mean it can mean a few different things. Maybe the politician sits on the board of the charity. There's ways that they're sort of metaphorically invested in the fate of the charity. Yep. Next. Oops. So after reading this paper, there were sort of two questions that it set me up for. One was, okay, here, the top one. There. Is corporate philanthropy used for political influence? So how I answer that, so I'm just going to basically ask what the Bertrand paper asked, but using I'm going to have a different way to test their hypothesis. So it's going to use a different measure of politician importance. So I say, do corporations donate more to charities linked to what I call pivotal U.S. senators? So I'm going to explain what pivotal means in a second, but it's just another measure of political importance. So the second question is, okay, how sinister is this problem? So I'll say, to what extent is it effective in changing legislative behavior? So to answer this question, I'm going to zoom in on just big oil companies, big energy companies, and then see if the charitable contributions from big energy companies sort of affect how politicians act on environmental issues. So here there's sort of two ways I measure that. One is how they vote on environmental bills, and then the other is how they talk about environmental issues on their floor speeches. And then for both of these questions, I'm going to look at PAC contributions as well. PAC contributions are openly political to sort of compare as a baseline. So, what does it mean for a U.S. senator to be pivotal? I told you this was like an alternative measure of politician importance. That's kind of this idea that if everyone on this side of the room, if there's 100 people on this side of the room, and you guys are all hardcore Republicans, and then there's 100 people on this side of the room, you guys are all hardcore Democrats, and then there's like one person in the middle who's just a moderate, and then we all vote on whether or not the minimum wage should be raised. Everyone here is going to vote one way, everyone here is going to vote one way. And this person in the middle, it's effectively going to come down to this person in the middle. So if I'm a corporation and I want to influence, I have $1 to influence this person, I'm going to want to target this person in the middle. So that's sort of the insight. The more sophisticated model is if we arrange all the senators from left to right, there's these sort of important points. This is maybe where Joe Manchin may be. There's the filibuster, where you overturn a veto. There's these important points where if you're a politician, a senator that's really close to that point, I give you a 1 for being pivotal. Filibuster pivotal, median pivotal, and if you're not, you just get a 0. So this is, you don't have to worry about the numbers, this is just my summary statistics table, but these are the variables I use to answer the first question of does pivotality, if that's a word, lead to more contributions. So here I have, this is economic score, that's an economic ideology that I can order all the politicians by, and then I also have a social score. So I also have a social score, so that's what your opinion on gun rights or something, and the other one is minimum wage. So there's different ways to arrange all the senators. And then I have what's CSR, that's just philanthropic contributions, so a given senator in a given time period, and this is the PAC contributions. So this is the second question. So the highlighted stuff here, the green, gray, and red, that stuff is environmental behavior variables. So the top one, pro-environmental voting, that's how much the proportion of times that a politician votes in a pro-environmental way on all these environmental bills. And then the 3 ones here are actually speech variables. So this is prevalence of pro-environmental speech in their floor speeches, prevalence of anti-environmental speech, and then neutral. And I'm going to tell you in a second how I categorize that. And then this is, again, corporate philanthropic contributions, and this is PAC contributions, but this is only from energy companies, only from the Chevrons, only from these large oil companies. So how did I make up these, pro-environmental, anti-environmental speech? So there's this paper that did a sentiment analysis, and they found that there's these 20 topics that show up in all these corporate, on these floor speeches in Congress when politicians are talking about climate change. So I have these 20 topics. I have to make the problem feasible, tractable for me to do. So what I do is I see which correlate positively with pro-environmental voting, and which correlate negatively with pro-environmental voting, and then which really don't correlate at all. And then I sort of categorize them into these 3 groups, and they kind of map onto our intuition. So anti-environmental, you see national security, anecdotal denial, blah, blah, blah. And then here you have public health, extreme weather, economic opportunity, all these things you would associate with more, pro-environmental stuff. And then this actually just shows the same thing. This is just a graph showing that, what I call pro-environmental correlates positively with voting well. And then the red is the anti-environmental, and the gray is not really correlated. And this just shows kind of over time, but it's not super important. All right. So the methodology for my first question, this is what we do. I'm regressing contributions. So we start out with philanthropic contributions, just on these, on these dummy variables for whether or not you're a veto pivot. So the idea is I want to see if you're a veto pivot, are you getting more contributions? And then I do the same thing, but instead of philanthropic contributions, I use PAC contributions here. Because again, I don't even know if this is a good measure in the first place, so we kind of have to test it with something that we know is political. and then I control for whether or not you're Republican and chamber seniority. So the second question is, okay, does this oil contributions affect how you act on the environment if you're a politician? It's a little bit tricky because if I'm an oil company and I see that you're a politician and then I meet with you and then I hand you some money and then you start to act environmental, that's like one channel. It can be like this influencing thing. But it could also be the case that a politician just starts to act more anti-environmental. I'm an oil company and I see that and I want to secure that politician's incumbency because I like their politics, and then I start donating. So these things sort of affect each other. So the question is, how can you isolate the effect of X on Y if that's what I'm looking for? And so there's a different there's some things you can do, and the one I'm going to focus on is using instrumental variables. So the idea of an instrument, I don't know how many people, I'm not going to explain instrumental variables now, but basically, you want to find this variable that's related to X, but not related to Y. So related to how much oil money a politician gets, but is not related to how they think about the environment. So what I constructed was, see this guy here, this is a politician. I got a measure for the generosity of the oil companies which donated to a given politician. So the idea is, if I'm this politician and there's a set of oil companies which donated to me in a given time period, this oil company donated to 3 other people, this oil company donated to 5 other people, C donated to 4 other people. If I average how much money they gave to each of these people, take these averages and then average over the company, then I'll get sort of this measure for how generous the oil company is to other people. So it's not related to this guy here. All right. So then basically using that instrument, I just want to see this wise environmental behavior, see the different effects between tax money and philanthropic money from oil companies. The numbers, not super important, but basically pivotality, it just all across the board doesn't predict well. But we do see if you're a filibuster pivot when we order things economically, corporations care about that and they'll give you more money. But philanthropic contributions, we don't really see that. One interesting thing though is that if we order things by social ideology, around the middle, corporations are a lot less likely to donate to charities that you're linked to. Maybe that might mean you're more controversial, social, corporations want to avoid controversy. I don't know. And then here, for the results of the effect of money on politician behavior, what I have, you see the tax contributions from big energy companies have a strong negative impact on how pro-environmental politicians are, whether it's speeches or voting, and that's in the yellow. And then philanthropic contributions from oil companies, you see the gray. There's not really much here. It's not significant and very small. And there's this weird thing where it's actually counterintuitive. There's weakly significant but economically small effect that if I'm an oil company and I give you money to your charity, you become more environmental a little bit down the line, but it's kind of weak. And there's not much we find there. So again, question 1, pivotality is not that good at predicting things. But we have 2 exceptions where it looks like if your economic pivot, corporate money goes up, tax money goes up. But if your social pivot, maybe corporate philanthropy goes down. Maybe that can tell you that, hey, maybe corporations are looking at the political careers of the board members of the charities that they donate to. And then for question 2, again, we find that PAC is way more important and that the philanthropy, it just doesn't seem to have too much of an effect. Okay, so finally, if I were to give any advice for the JP, I would say when you read something, don't read passively, read it aggressively and always think, what question can I ask? What question does it set me up for? And when you're reading, that's the second bullet, I think it's better. So when I started my JP, I read a bunch of different stuff, kind of superficially. And when I really started to make progress was when I sat down and I looked at one paper and read it really in depth. And then I understood the moving parts of that paper. And then I could just ask a question very closely related to that paper. And that was it. And then I was so that's one thing I would definitely suggest. Also, ask everyone for help. I thank the whole army of people at the start of this. I was just bothering my TAs, bothering my professors. If you bounce your ideas off of people who are trained economists, your ideas are going to get better, and the bad ones will sort of weed themselves out. Sebastian, my TA from an econ class, I would just always ask him questions. In fact, I think he told me that everyone here can come to him for questions. You said I could tell you that, right? Yeah. Okay. Obviously, start early on the data as well. You can always compress how much you're writing. You can write faster, type things up. You can't compress the time it takes to work on the data. You just can't do that. It just takes a lot of time and you can't hurry it up. And then finally, the last bullet, what I mean by that when I say research is not an efficient market, I mean that there's kind of the sense that I had when I started the JP, where it's like, this is kind of like make-believe. It's like, there's real economists out there, and there's me doing this thing here. It's kind of not going to be that. I'm not going to find something cool that people haven't found already. And I just want to say that there's so many like novel data sets, so many different questions you can ask. You can just connect two data sets. There's not enough time for all the professional economists to go pursue every question they can think of, or for them to read every paper to motivate a question in the first place. So just like really emphasize that with your JP, you can contribute something that is like worthwhile, novel, and interesting to what we know about something. And yeah, so with that, I end my presentation. Thank you guys for listening.
Catherine's up next. So Catherine McIntyre, and your slides are here.
So for my JP, I looked at the effect of ESG and environmental practices on financial performance of the S&P 500 companies. And first off, thank you to Professor Brunemeyer for her guidance throughout this process. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, and these three pillars are commonly used to consider how sustainable and ethical businesses' practices are. And we've seen in recent years that there's been tremendous growth in the popularity of ESG, and there is some evidence that companies that have better ESG policies do also exhibit better financial performance. So for my JP, I looked at what's the effect of ESG performance on corporate financial performance. I then disaggregated the ESG score into the three subcomponents of environmental, social, and governance. Then, due to just personal interest in climate change and the importance of environmentally conscious policy, I looked at the effects of the three subcomponents of the environmental score individually on corporate financial performance. Then lastly, for the S&P 500 companies, I broke them down by sector and looked at the individual relationships there between ESG score and financial performance. So for each of these explanatory variables, I hypothesized a positive relationship. So my data was sourced from the Wharton Research Database. I used Refinitiv's ESG scores, which aim to kind of comprehensively capture the quality and the extent of companies' ESG policy and just how much they report their policy and are transparent about those types of factors. So my main explanatory variables, as I mentioned, are ESG score, the disaggregated score, and then the three environmental components that generate the environmental score from Refinitiv's ESG score. So that's resource use, emissions, and environmental innovation. The main control variables I looked at were leverage ratio for risk, total revenue for size, and R&D expenditure. And then for corporate financial performance, I looked at two accounting-based measures, which were return on assets and return on capital, and then Tobin's Q for a market-based measure. So the first part of my methodology was just a general fixed effects regression model. So here I have the 7 different regressions with the explanatory variables, and for each line that was conducted 3 times for each regression of each outcome variable. So that's return on assets, return on capital, and Tobin's Q. I also added a quadratic score term, and that's to account for the possibility of a U-shaped relationship between the ESG score and the outcome, since as companies adopt perhaps better ESG policies, there may be financial losses in the short run, but in the long run, they may gain as a result. Then I have the control variables, the time and entity fixed effects, and the error term. Next, I incorporated lag terms. So this is to account for the possibility that better ESG policy may take some time to manifest in these financial returns. So if companies adopt better policy in the prior period, we may not see the financial gains until the next period. And then I also added an additional control variable for the lagged financial performance to account for the fact that past financial performance is likely correlated with current period financial performance. Next, for the sector analysis, I broke the companies up by sector in the S&P 500. However, the companies aren't equally represented from each sector. So there are some companies that had less than 100 observations across my data set just due to the types of companies that are in the S&P 500. So I only analyzed 6 of the S&P 500 sectors. And then for each sector, I just conducted my general model. So that's just the effective overall ESG score with the quadratic term on the 3 different outcome variables. And I did that for each of these sectors. Next, I did an instrumental variable regression model. So I instrumented prior year's CFP on the ESG regressor. And that's due to the fact that past financial performance is likely correlated with current ESG performance. So companies' financial status may influence how able they are to implement better ESG policy and their capacity to do so. So I first conducted the first stage regression of 2-stage least squares, and that allowed me to test for instrument relevance by assessing the first stage F statistic. Additionally, in theory, the instrument was exogenous, but since my model was not over-identified, I couldn't test for exogeneity. From the first stage regressions, I then conducted the second stage regressions when the instrument was deemed to be relevant. So that was only for overall ESG score and resource use score for return on assets and Tobin's Q. So in my results, these are kind of my core results looking at the effect of overall ESG score and the 3 disaggregated components on CFP. So I found that in these first 2 specifications, which was the model containing the lag term for overall ESG score, there was this marginal effect that's statistically significant at the 1 in 5% level, and it's positive. So that supports my hypothesis of this positive association between ESG score improvements and better corporate financial performance. Overall, there were no statistically significant results for Tobin's Q, and then looking at the disaggregated environmental component, there are no significant results there. Looking at social score and governance score, this gives some insight into what's driving this effect of ESG score improvements generating better financial returns. So for the social score in these same specifications 1 and 2, looking at the accounting-based measures of financial performance, we see that there's this positive effect. But then looking at the quadratic model, we see that there's this positive relationship between social score and CFP as well as governance score and CFP. So that suggests that there's essentially this U-shaped relationship there, so there may be some short-run losses as better ESG policies are implemented, but still gains generating from improvements in the social and the corporate governance areas. So these may be driving that positive relationship of overall ESG score. Next, looking at the disaggregated environmental components of resource use emissions and environmental innovation, there were no statistically significant results here, which was as expected. Next, looking at the sector breakdown. So between the 6 sectors I evaluated, only 3 had statistically significant results pictured here. However, for information technology, there's only 1 coefficient that is significant, and it's at the 10% level, so not super relevant. But looking at consumer staples and materials, it's interesting that the results are effectively the opposite for the 2 different sectors. So for consumer staples, there's that positive quadratic relationship, but it's negative looking at the materials sector for these accounting-based measures of CFP. And then notably, the signs of the linear estimates are the opposite of the quadratic estimates. So it's possible that the short run is just relatively long in this time period, and the linear model is still able to capture that initial relationship in the quadratic relationship. Next, looking at the IV results. So overall, the instrumental variable results are encouraging, and they support my initial findings from the panel regressions. So the coefficients that are estimated from the 2-stage least squares are the same sign and larger in magnitude than the marginal effects from the panel regressions. So that suggests that the IV regression results align with my original standard regression results, and they're all significant and they match the signs. So it supports my hypothesis that ESG improvements are causing an increase in return on assets and helps to suggest a causal relationship in that direction. So overall, I saw that across these accounting-based measures of CFP, ESG score had this statistically significant positive association with CFP, and that's consistent with the existing literature that tends to find a positive relationship there. And then using the IV regressions, it helped to substantiate this finding, and it was also able to advance the notion of this causal effect there, that these ESG improvements are really causing better financial performance. And then the results for social and governance scores showed that these 2 components of ESG are what are really driving this positive effect. And it's also notable that there are these quadratic relationships there, so companies may be able to expect these negative returns in the short run. And then the further investigations, the environmental score didn't seem any significant results. And then overall, looking at the 2 S&P sectors that had these significant results, it was interesting that they were the opposite, but I wasn't able to support my hypothesis of a more general trend across S&P sectors, since I wasn't able to evaluate all of them given the sample size and only had significant results for about half. So overall, some limitations of my study. The first is, like I just mentioned, the sample size of the S&P 500. So further research could look at a more diversified sample of companies with representation from all of the sectors. And additionally, for consumer staples and materials and these other sectors, it would be interesting to also do the disaggregated environmental, social, and governance scores to see where those relationships I did find were coming from, like which components of ESG. And then there's also limited instrument relevance. So the instrument is only relevant for about 4 of the models for the 2 outcome variables, and then for resource use and overall ESG score. So further research could employ additional variables in order to perhaps get variables that were more relevant, and then also using an over-identified model to be able to test for instrument exogeneity. And then overall, the coefficient estimates for Tobin's Q tended to be insignificant, but also negative, which was in contrast to these to accounting-based measures of CFP. So that would be an interesting area for further study. And some existing literature also did find this effect. They tend to see these negative but not significant results for Tobin's Q. It might be just that these gains in financial performance are only kind of manifesting in accounting-based terms as opposed to these market-based measures. And then lastly, there is inconsistency between the different ESG score providers out there. So I took my ESG scores as kind of given and true. But there are many different score providers, and it would be interesting for further research to look at all the different ESG score providers and then compare how these same results might result from looking at these different scoring metrics. So for some policy implications, so companies similar to those in the S&P 500, so large public companies in the U.S., should invest in efforts in ESG improvement, and they can expect better financial performance as a direct result. Though we expect that corporate policy may tend to focus on the social and corporate governance aspects, given that these were the two main areas that tended to actually grow CFP in the long run. Nevertheless, it was still interesting that the environmental improvements area didn't have a negative significant relationship. So given my results, companies might therefore be able to still make these better environmental policies and not expect that they're going to have significant losses in financial performance as a result. And in light of climate change, the better environmentally conscious policy is still essential. Then just looking at the magnitude of the estimates, the marginal effects that were estimated did seem to be relatively small when put in context, but not completely insignificant. That would be an area for further focus to see how companies might interpret this effect. But overall, the results are encouraging. And if ESG does enhance these financial returns, it might motivate companies to adopt more responsible policies and lead to greater societal benefits. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And next up is Georgia Neighbors.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Georgia Neighbors, and my junior paper was titled Revisiting Mortgage Discrimination and Racial Redlining: An Analysis of HMDA Data Before, During, and After the Great Recession. And my paper was advised by Professor Ergin, so I thank him for his support throughout the process. So just to start with a bit of background, my paper examines two different forms of housing market discrimination. The first is individual level mortgage discrimination, which occurs when a loan application is denied due to the personal rather than economic characteristics of the borrower. And the second is redlining, which is a form of neighborhood-based discrimination in which lenders refuse to extend credit for properties in areas with large minority populations based entirely on socially constructed notions of risk. And I examined these two phenomena using data from the state of Georgia and in the context of the Great Recession. And the motivation for that was really that the housing market crisis of 2008 was very explicitly tied to discrimination in housing. And then in addition to that, the economic impacts of the recession have been shown to have significant racial skew. So there is an expansive section of literature that's dedicated to studying both individual level and neighborhood-based discrimination. The Boston Federal Reserve, for example, found that Black and Hispanic applicants in the area were roughly 60% more likely than similarly situated whites to be denied mortgage credit. And there's also evidence that in the post-recession period, having Black or Hispanic neighbors significantly lowered the chances of mortgage success. And what these papers have in common is that many of them are reliant on data provided under the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, or the HMDA. And this is the data set that my paper uses. And it includes information about the applicant, the property, and the loan. But what the HMDA excludes is important information relevant to the applicant's creditworthiness, such as their FICO score. And for this reason, papers that are reliant exclusively on data from the HMDA tend to overestimate housing market discrimination through omitted variable bias. And the literature has developed a variety of ways to kind of circumvent this issue. Some papers simply do additional data collection, but my paper applies a newly proposed methodology by Dellis and Papadopoulos in their examination of recession-era mortgage discrimination, called two-stage residual differentiation, and they find significant evidence of discrimination against Black and Hispanic borrowers, although these disparities were smaller than originally anticipated. So from a review of the literature, and then given that Delis and Papadopoulos did not apply their methodology to neighborhood-based discrimination, I arrived upon two research questions. The first was, how does an applicant's race or ethnicity impact the likelihood that their loan application is denied? And then the second is, how does minority population of the property census tract relate to the likelihood of the loan being denied? I also developed three hypotheses. The first is that the probability of denial will be greater for Black and Hispanic applicants relative to white applicants. The second was that seeking a property in an area with a larger minority population would increase the likelihood that the loan is denied. And then the third is that this impact of a larger minority population will be even greater if the applicant is non-white. So as I mentioned, my methodology is borrowed from Delis and Papadopoulos, and the model runs in two stages. In the first stage, I generate two equations for the supply and demand of mortgage loans. So in equation one, I regress the dollar-denominated loan amount supplied on the applicant's income in geographic fixed effects. And in this case, the residual term is representative of all of the unobserved factors that are impacting the size of the loan supplied, such as the applicant's FICO score or their employment history. And equation two regresses the loan amount demanded on the applicant's income in geographic fixed effects. And in this case, the residual is representative of all of these unobserved variables that are impacting the size of the loan demanded. And this could be things like the loan to value ratio of the property. And I then take the difference in residuals to form a new variable UH that is essentially representative of the disparities between a bank's business model for supplying loans and then a lender's reasoning for requesting loans. And given that applicants aren't requesting loans that they reasonably believe will be denied, this will be incorporate all of these unobserved factors that aren't included in the data itself. So the second stage of my model is a simple linear probability model in which I regress a binary variable for whether the loan is denied on variables for the applicant's race, the minority population of the property census tract, as well as interaction terms. And again, the final variable in this regression is UH, which was generated in the first stage and is meant to account for omitted variables more properly as I'm estimating discrimination. And I run these models for 3 time periods from 2007 to 2011 using data from Georgia. So my results are shown here, and regressions 1, 2, and 3 all indicate that being Black had a positive impact on the likelihood that the loan is denied. And similarly, for Hispanic applicants, the probability of denial increased before and after the recession, although there was no evidence that this was the case during the recession. I find evidence that Asians were generally less likely than similarly situated white applicants to be denied mortgage credit. And then there is some evidence of disparities between whites and other racial minorities, although these differences were largely not sustained across all 3 time periods and oftentimes were not statistically significant. And curiously, my results don't show that any of these disparities were made significantly worse as a result of the recession or during the recession. And here's the second half of my regression table. And again, the 3 columns are each corresponding to the time periods that I examined. And my results show that minority population positively impacted the probability of denial, and this was statistically significant, although this impact was small. And this was true before and during the recession for white applicants. And then the interaction terms allow the impact of minority population to vary with the applicant's race. And what these show is that for Black applicants, Asians, Hispanics, as well as Pacific Islanders, the impact of seeking a property in an area with a large minority population was even greater than it was for white applicants. So all of these racial and ethnic minorities were even more adversely impacted in terms of their chances of mortgage success. And furthermore, curiously, the coefficient on minority population was negative after the recession for white applicants, but the interaction terms show that for each racial and ethnic minority, this impact did remain positive. But again, my results don't necessarily show very clearly that these disparities were made worse by or during the Great Recession. So just to conclude, My findings do show significant evidence of disparities between Black and white borrowers and Hispanic and non-Hispanic borrowers, and even when I use methodology that accounts for omitted variables more properly, there is evidence of both individual level and neighborhood-based discrimination. My paper was affected by several limitations, and just to name two, my data set did not indicate which loans were prime and which loans are subprime, which is problematic given that several papers have identified a trend in the pre-recession period in which banks would disproportionately market subprime loans to people of color. And these loans were discriminatory and they were predatory, but they were technically approved. And since my model's only really examining denials, I'm perhaps understating the level of discrimination in 2007. Furthermore, a linear probability model does potentially yield nonsensical probability predictions that are greater than 1. But given the large number of fixed effects in my paper, neither a logit nor probit model was possible, so the OLS estimator remained the most suitable option. But I think regardless of these limitations, my results show evidence of failures in federal housing policy that's meant to ensure equality in housing markets. And I think this is problematic for lawmakers that are not only trying to prevent current discrimination, but also reverse historic trends and rectify these massive inequalities that have emerged from a century worth of racist housing policy in the United States. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Georgia. And next up is Jean.
Good afternoon. My name is Jean, and I wrote my junior paper on the effect of the 2015 refugee influx on native employment rates in Germany using a differences in differences analysis. I would like to thank my advisor, Professor Sylvia Weierbrock, and my George Nikolakoutis for their extensive guidance on this project. So the motivation for my paper was really the 2015 European refugee crisis. In this time, there was an influx of over 1 million asylum seekers from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq into the EU borders. Germany was one of the largest receiving host nations of this influx and are now host to approximately 1.2 million refugees in the present. The issues that Germany faces to this day are barriers to integration, such as lower wages and employment outcomes, and also issues in social and economic integration for refugees in comparison to other migrants. For the economic theory, we see that a short-run adjustment due to migration influx is that if immigrants and natives are perfect substitutes, we think that native employment would decrease, and if there are complements, native employment would increase. So this is the basis for a lot of arguments for and against migration in policy. So this leads me to the research question of how the 2015 refugee influx has impacted the employment of native workers across Germany's 16 states. So for my literature review, it's always a good place to begin with survey papers, the first of which I read in my Economics of Europe class that semester, titled The Labor Market Integration of Refugee Migrants in High-Income Countries. This paper made important definitions and distinctions between refugees and economic migrants and the barriers to integration that refugees face, and finding persistently lower employment and wage outcomes for refugees in high-income countries. Some papers that influenced my methodology were David Cart's The Impact of the Mariel Boat Lift on the Miami Labor Market, which used a differences in differences estimation, and I read this in my labor economics class that same fall semester. Some more motivation for this research is that there are also conflicting findings in migration literature, some of which finding positive and negative effects of immigration on labor productivity. So for my data, I compiled a panel of 16 German states from 2007 to 2019. The first source I used was the Eurostat regional statistics, and this contained my dependent variable, which is the native employment rate. And then in this case, native is defined as German citizen. I also repeat my methodology on overall employment rate in each state as robustness check. And this data set also contains information on total population and total working age population. And for my asylum-seeking statistics, I used the Federal Statistical Office of Germany, and this contained refugee population and refugee working age population. So this leads me to my independent variable, which is the ratio of refugee to total working age population. In the migration literature, the measure of influx in a given location is often measured by the ratio of immigrants to total population in that area. So this is consistent with that literature. and in this case I use refugee working age population to total. The first figure on the left here displays the absolute numbers of refugee working age population in each state. So I highlighted the states that had the 3 highest numbers and the 3 lowest numbers in total population for refugees. In this case, we see that there's a huge peak after the 2015 crisis, and the trend is roughly uniform over time, and I reason that that's due to the distribution quotas that are implemented by Germany upon arrival for refugees. So in Germany, upon arrival, refugees are assigned to their respective states under mandatory distribution quota, and we'll see later that that is the mechanism behind my methodology later. The figure to the right, figure 2, is the ratio of refugee to total working age population, which is my independent variable. So we see that the same states that are highlighted in figure 1 are highlighted here, and there's a lot of variation once we compute the measure of immigration as a concentration in comparison to absolute totals. So an example that I brought out is city-state Bremen, which is smaller in population, and we see that there's a smaller absolute value of refugee population in the first figure, but in the second figure, once the concentration of immigration is calculated, it is much higher than the other states. So for my methodology, I computed a differences in differences model, the first of which has 2 time periods with native employment rate as the outcome and an interaction term between the independent variable and an indicator for the observation being after 2015. This was actually the only equation that I proposed in my prospectus at the time. It contained state fixed effects, but as I gained more experience in econometrics through my coursework, I also added a multiple time period model to my JP, and this included year fixed effects and state-specific year trends. Additionally, these estimates consider each state with equal value, even though there's variation in the population. So I also weight the estimates by initial total working age population to see the differences in outcome. Additionally, I add a dynamic model with 2 leads and lags of the independent variable to measure for delayed adjustment or long-term effects. So for my assumptions and limitations, with the differences in differences, we make the assumption of parallel trends that the states would otherwise exhibit similar market trends and prone to the same countrywide policies and economic shocks. The limitation of this is that labor market shocks are imperfect and there is regional variation in industries, also between East and West Germany. Our assumption for exogeneity, which I mentioned earlier, are the mandatory distribution quotas, which assign refugees to the states, and we also validate this with the variation in ratio of refugee to total working age population in comparison to absolute numbers, which I showed in the previous figures. The limitation of this is that if the assumption is violated, then employment effect is overestimated. So for my results, the first model that I estimated for my prospectus was statistically significant, and there is a positive marginal effect of ratio on native employment rate. However, there is a negative treatment effect, and I reason that this could have been weakened by the sharp increase and delayed adjustment after the 2015 crisis, and it's not very well specified with 2 models, as well as a short time period in our data set. I next estimate the multi-period model, and I found that this was better fitted than the 2-period model. It had a higher R-squared, so including the year and state fixed effects. The effect is still positive, but also much lower in magnitude and level of significance. I reason that this was a more reasonable estimate. Also, when weighting by the initial total population, the effect becomes insignificant, and also further decrease in magnitude. Also, computing the confidence interval, it contains some null effects that suggest that the independent variable might not affect the native employment rate at all. As for the dynamic model, I found significant effects that were positive and increasing in magnitude for my first and second lags. I reason that this may be due to a delay in labor market trends and in adjustment to migration shocks, and suggests the potential for positive long-run effects. So to conclude, I conclude that there is no significant evidence that the 2015 refugee influx negatively impacted native employment rates in Germany, and this is evident from the regions with higher concentrations of influx having higher native employment. And also this positive effect is decreasing in magnitude and significance with each of the specifications that I use. And these results are in favor of economic theory as immigrants and natives being complementary rather than substitutes. And some possible explanations that I gave for this are that barriers to integration and labor market frictions prevent refugees from really negatively affecting the market for native workers. Also, if they dominate different industries, and especially in the short run, there is not a significant effect. Research is also with limitations in data, both in time and detail. An ideal data set would contain individual level characteristics that would control for education and experience and country of origin, for example. And also, I was also unable to look at wage, which is usually more available in microdata sets that are restricted. So that would also be a good indicator variable in places employment rate to look at. So therefore, I interpret these results as short run and an upper bound of the true effect, but it also provides motivation for further research in the long run. Thank you. Good luck on your JPs.
Our final presenter, Shruti Venkat.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Well, I guess you have to be here, but still. My name is Shruti, and I wrote my junior independent work on the effect of online gambling regulation on cannabis and alcohol addiction. I'd like to thank my advisor, Professor Micah Spiazzi, for all of her help on this, and my amazing AI, Lucas Mon. So a little bit of background. What is traditional gambling? Traditional gambling is betting and engaging in physical table games at a real casino. There's that adrenaline rush, active crowd, and a lot more relaxed rules. And then online gambling, as the name suggests, is on a mobile platform. So done anywhere in the world through an app or some other platform, but a lot more enforced rules. So there's a lot of research that actually shows gambling is heavily correlated with drug and alcohol addiction. And usually states respond with regulation. Now specifically, I looked at Quebec. In 2010, they basically announced the public offering of a legal, secure online gambling platform and website called Espacia, and that's basically what we're going to be focusing on today. There's not a lot of research that actually looks at online gambling and traditional gambling, so that's kind of where my research comes in, because in reality, things are actually interconnected between the two. My research question is, how does the regulation of online gambling impact the prevalence of physical gambling and online gambling? And what are the consequential effects on cannabis and alcohol consumption? A lot of motivation basically shows that the gambling market is huge, over $40 billion in yearly revenue, and a significant portion of the world's population actually is addicted to gambling every single year. This is, again, connecting the dots from the regulation all the way to the health impact, which really hasn't been done a lot before. My hypothesis is that Quebec's 2010 gambling regulation was so restrictive that it turned gamblers away from online gambling towards physical gambling, in turn actually worsening alcohol and cannabis consumption. So if you guys remember the substitution effect, that's basically what I'm basing this on. Thinking that consumers actually look at online and physical gambling as substitutes of each other. So when one is so restrictive, they're actually going to go to the other one. And then this is some relevant literature. I'm not going to go through all of it, but I guess advice for looking at relevant literature, even if you don't find papers that refer to your exact topic, looking at papers that have a similar framework or methodology can be really useful. A lot of my literature focused on the print industry and the music streaming industry to kind of see how digital platforms affected a variety of industries. Now, looking at my data set, it was a 5-year project. It basically showed data on gambling behaviors and their impacts across a variety of health and socioeconomic factors in Quebec, and they had 3 regions that they looked at. It was surveyed once in 2009 and once in 2012, so once before the regulation and once after. And I was interested in basically the physical and online gambling prevalences as well as the health impacts that resulted from it. So this was a reputable, credible data set. Other studies use it, which is definitely something that you should look for. And the data set actually doesn't mention anything about the 2010 regulation. So I kind of found that on my own and then looked at this data set and kind of connected the dots together. So I would encourage you to be as creative as possible. So as I actually looked at the data, I realized we had to take into account how far someone was from a physical casino. So I basically used Google Maps to calculate from each regional municipality capital to the nearest casino in each region. Because if you're too far, even if you find online gambling too restrictive, you may not drive 150 miles to the nearest casino. But that's not the same if you're only 5 miles away. So that actually is something that we had to take into account. The treatment group here is groups 2 and 3, which are the ones that are considered farther. because we assume they have a greater impact due to this regulation, because them switching to these physical casinos is what we want to actually see. That was something that I didn't expect going into, but that's why when we say get started on your data set early, you're going to find a lot of hurdles that you have to jump over. So this was something that I found. And my estimation strategy was an ordinary least squares regression model with a difference in difference analysis. So I basically compare the treatment effect from 2012 to 2009 to see what that effect of the regulation is. I'm looking specifically at the gambling prevalences of both physical and online gambling, as well as alcohol, cannabis consumption, and alcohol addiction. And there's a bunch of different control variables, including marital status, sex, if you have internet at home, because that affects if you can gamble online, things like that. There were some limitations that I faced with this data set, and it's not the same population in 2009 as it is in 2012. People are growing older, people are dying, there's babies being born, though they're not the ones being surveyed, but populations are basically changing. So that doesn't mean you have to throw the data set out, but I would just be cognizant of those kinds of effects and apply appropriate assumptions. These are just some more regressions, kind of the same thing with controls, with additional controls, seeing what actually affects the results. And what I actually had to do was, I think Asher talked about this, verify the parallel trends assumption, which basically says for these control variables, absent the intervention, the trends actually stay the same. So the populations aren't drastically changing. So I looked at the income gap between urban and rural regions. I looked at the proportion of males and females in these populations. So populations are not drastically changing to the point where the data does not apply. But across the board, I found that traditional physical casino gambling actually statistically significantly increased, which was in line with our hypothesis. So these are some of my regression results, and it shows that this gambling prevalence did increase across the board, in line with our hypothesis that traditional physical gambling increases as a result of online gambling regulation, because gamblers actually see them as substitutes, and when one is so restrictive, they actually switch to the other. So that's the significant results, but I thought it was also interesting to look at the non-significant results. Cannabis consumption increased, whereas alcohol consumption decreased. And we expected both cannabis and alcohol consumption to increase. So with cannabis, there was no interference with the data. There was no major confounding factors. No notable legislation was passed. Cannabis is not legalized, so all of it's basically unregulated use. And the results were in line with our expectation. However, with alcohol, that's not the same case. There could have been a possible manipulation of results due to these confounding factors. Canada actually faced an economic downturn in about late 2008, 2009, which could have led to a lot of people engaging in alcohol misuse. So if you're using a lot of alcohol in 2008, 2009, they might kind of lean off of that and wane down, which could have shown as a decrease in our data, because our data did not, take into account that 2008, 2009 downturn. And so it's possible people leaned off of it, and that's why it showed a decrease, even if the actual attributed effect to our regulation was an increase, which is something we may not know, and I kind of saw this after doing all the analysis. But yeah, the next steps, what does this actually mean in terms of gambling regulation? It's clear that the approach that Quebec took in 2010 didn't have the intended effects. It actually had adverse effects on gamblers. So it increased traditional gambling frequency and increased negative health outcomes, specifically cannabis. Perhaps even alcohol, but that's not what our data shows specifically. Suggestions to actually fixing this include making traditional gambling less attractive, which is definitely very difficult, but online gambling more attractive, perhaps even less restrictive. It's a trade-off. You're going to be loosening restrictions on online gambling, but it may actually help health outcomes. There's definitely a lot more work to be done looking at the appropriate regulation responses to such forms of gambling, but hopefully the above recommendations are a start in the right direction. But yeah, that's all I have for today. Thank you so much.
All right, so I'll return to the slide in just a second, but I wanted to have a collective round of applause for all of our All right, so do you guys have any questions to the presenters as the experts today in our, the experts that we're showcasing today? So we can just have, audience questions. I think there are microphones, but if you are loud enough,
Yeah, I guess I can start. Yeah, absolutely. It changed a lot. I came in wanting to look at like the gaming and sports betting industry from like a financial aspect. And the biggest thing is data availability. If there's no data, you can't really do much. And I think gaming, sports betting, though it exists, is a very kind of recent thing. There just wasn't that much data there, so I had to kind of switch the question. Also, Quebec, like, I don't really care about Canada that much. I'm so honest, it just happened to be a great data set that I used and gave me a great question. So it's sometimes you just have to change your question based on the data that's available. So yeah.
I think for me as well, I think I mentioned in the slides, I really wanted to look at wage and employment outcomes and also on an individual level. But I quickly realized that microdata is very restricted, especially in terms of labor market outcomes for individual level characteristics. So I definitely had to change my methodology and find ways to make do with what I had from aggregated and publicly available data.
I think that when you're reading papers, like the questions that you're asking should be informed by what's actually feasible. So like you should be asking the questions in terms of variables, like the effect of this variable on this. So, and also thinking about, well, is this variable something that someone has measured and is available? So I didn't change too much. My problem, I kept thinking of other cool questions to ask, like in the related research, and then actually following up on each question takes a long time, to pursue each one. So you have to sort of see what's feasible, and then I'm rambling now.
Yeah, for me, I had kind of a similar situation. Mine didn't change too much. That's partially because I kind of found my topic from the data set. Therefore, I was just kind of informing my methodology and my research questions from the variables that I saw available. But as I was looking at the literature, I did see some things that other studies where I was kind of trying to simulate their methodology to some extent, where they were considering other factors in their data. So it then prompted me to kind of take a look and make sure that I was keeping track of everything and making all the necessary considerations. So it would also be something to keep in mind.
I think for me, the biggest consideration was finding a research question that hadn't already been asked, given that my topic was something that was very well studied, and obviously economists have done a lot of research about the recession and housing. So for me, I came in with a research question that had already been asked, and really the only thing that I had to do was kind of find out how I can fit into the literature, and that's kind of how I came about a newly proposed methodology, how I integrated that into my research.
How shocked were you about the amount of time that you had to invest into working with your data, keeping your data was it very different from what you're doing?
I think I can start off. I think I would have spent more time cleaning my data in the fall semester than actually writing my JP in the spring semester. And that had to do with, especially with my publicly available data, and it was very finicky. I can give you a little anecdote maybe for my for the statistics that I got for working age population. So I had to manually stratify my working age population. One of my data sets from Eurostat did that, but my other data set or my other source didn't do that. So I had to manually click ages 15, 16, 17, 18, and then aggregate them in an Excel spreadsheet, which maybe there would have been an easier way to do that. I did not know at the time. But another thing with not having a lot of econometrics beforehand, I'd only taken 302. And I think I mentioned that in my prospectus, I only proposed one equation, which was the first model that I estimated. And I would really say taking 313 in the spring helped me develop the rest of my JP, and it was a large improvement for my prospectus. So maybe some advice, even if your prospectus isn't the best that it can be, you can always make the improvement in the JP and add your econometric knowledge that you gain in your coursework. So thank you to Sebastian, my preceptor from 313.
So, I mean, sort of like having your question and your representation line up is going to make a really.
Also, on this point of the prospectus, like, don't sleep on the prospectus. It's worth like half of, in your GPA meaning, it's worth half of one like full course. So like, I didn't do so hot on my prospectus, and I was like, make up a lot of work. So.
Yeah. If I can go. One thing I would have done differently would be to just run less regression and try to kind of rein in the scope more. I think kind of like Casey said, like there were some things that I thought would be interesting to do. There was like one part of my analysis that I ended up cutting over winter break because I realized it wasn't really feasible to actually code that into data. And it was still kind of, there were a lot of components and moving pieces, and part of that was because my topic was pretty heavily researched, so I was matching the methodology of one paper in particular, but differentiating in a few different ways with different data and such. But I'd say like the scope of your paper doesn't need to be too crazy. Like just doing kind of basic regressions or using an instrument or something is perfectly fine. So if I were to do something differently, I would kind of not do as many subcomponents just because there were things I was interested in but wasn't super relevant.
I think adding to that, I wish I understood the role of like an advisor in AI earlier on, because I think I met with my advisor 3 times. Like I could probably count on both my hands throughout the entire year because her job was very overarching comments, bigger scope picture, and I think I started sending her like data stuff, and I wouldn't get a reply, and I was like, what's going on? Because that's not her job. And so my AI and I would email him like every day almost. He's asking questions like, can we meet tomorrow? Can we meet tomorrow? And he was super, super helpful. And so all the little stuff, I would go to your AI and make sure you kind of understand the difference between who you're meeting with and what questions to ask them. So don't go to your advisor like I did in the fall with like specific data questions because that's not her job. She's not looking at your data. That's like a very overarching question of like, is this research question even possible? So I think understanding those different roles is really important.
But generally speaking, like more AI is looking at your data. So I know there's like a lot of here at the AI. So keep that in mind when you're going AI. Doesn't matter if you get significant results. You can have a plus paper that is presented next year in our showcase that are like, yep, my hypothesis for that math teacher, or inconclusive, or
just a final, pieces of advice. That is, I guess that disappeared, but maybe everybody already saw that. I feel like we've kind of covered all of them already. And I think I just have to say thank you one more time to Dana and Kathleen and to the JIW team, Kelly and her team. And to our student JIW superstars. And then just so you guys know, this event was brought to you by the Griswold Center for Economic Policy Studies. You guys are all welcome to join our public events. We have a public event with Professor Lord Nicholas Stern, one of the first economists to really identify climate change as the challenge it was going to be. That's a public event. Is it here? On October 11th, and then a book talk with Professor Alan Blinder on October 27th, a monetary and fiscal history of the United States. And if you're ever interested in our events, just go to gseps.princeton.edu where you'll see more of our programming. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Good luck with your JPs.